I carried a federal badge for 32 years, but nothing in my career prepared me for what I encountered in the Appalachian wilderness in 1989. The Bureau has known about the creature since the 1950s, has tracked it across 6 states, and has maintained a classified task force dedicated solely to containing information about its existence. I was part of that task force for the last 15 years of my career, and what we documented in those mountains defies everything the public believes about the natural world. The evidence sits in a vault 3 stories beneath the Hoover Building, and the protocols we followed were designed not to capture the creature, but to ensure that no proof ever reached the outside world. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I joined the Bureau in 1967 fresh out of law school with the kind of idealism that gets beaten out of you after your first year in the field. I worked bank robberies in Chicago, moved to organized crime in New York, and spent 5 years in counterintelligence during the Cold War, when everyone saw Soviet agents in every shadow. I thought I had seen the full scope of what federal law enforcement dealt with, the corruption and violence and secrets that never made it into official reports. I was wrong. In the spring of 1989, my supervisor called me into his office and closed the door, which was never a good sign. He slid a thin file across the desk marked with a classification level I had never seen before, higher than top secret, something that required 3 separate security clearances just to acknowledge its existence. The file contained incident reports from park rangers, state police, and local sheriffs spanning 4 decades. The reports described massive bipedal creatures in remote sections of the Appalachian range, encounters that followed consistent patterns, and included physical evidence that had been systematically collected and suppressed. My supervisor told me I had been selected for a special assignment, that my background in both criminal investigation and intelligence work made me suitable for something the Bureau had been handling quietly since the Eisenhower administration. He said the work would require extended periods in the field, absolute discretion, and a willingness to participate in activities that existed outside normal investigative protocols. He said I could decline with no impact on my career, but that if I accepted, I would never be able to discuss what I learned with anyone outside a very small circle of cleared personnel. I accepted because curiosity has always been my greatest weakness, and because the alternative was another decade of white-collar crime cases that had long since lost any sense of challenge. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a conference room at Quantico with 9 other agents, all of us brought in from different field offices, none of us knowing why we had been summoned. The briefing officer was a senior agent I will not name who had been with the task force since its inception in 1952. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He turned on a projector and showed us photographs that looked like they had been taken with equipment from the 1950s and 60s, grainy black and white images of enormous footprints in mud, massive handprints on trees, and in one case a partial body print in soft ground that showed the outline of something that stood at least 9 feet tall and weighed well over 600 pounds. The officer told us the creature had been documented in every state along the Appalachian range from Georgia to Maine. He said encounters spiked during certain seasons and in certain weather conditions, and that the Bureau had been tracking these patterns for nearly 40 years. He said the task force had 3 primary objectives. First, document all encounters and collect physical evidence before it could reach civilian researchers or the media. Second, maintain relationships with local law enforcement and park services to ensure immediate notification of any incidents. Third, and most important, prevent any conclusive proof from entering the public domain through whatever means necessary. He emphasized that last point. Whatever means necessary. I understood what he was telling us without him having to spell it out. We were not investigators in the traditional sense. We were suppressors. The training lasted 3 weeks and covered wilderness survival, evidence collection in remote environments, and protocols for dealing with witnesses who had seen too much or documented too clearly. We learned how to identify authentic tracks from hoaxes, how to estimate the creature's size and weight from stride length and depth of prints, and how to recognize the territorial markers it left in the form of broken branches, stacked stones, and what the veterans called tree breaks, massive trunks snapped at 8 or 9 feet high that required force no human could generate. We studied hair samples under microscopes, examined dental impressions cast from marks on deer carcasses, and reviewed audio recordings of vocalizations that sounded like nothing in any zoological database. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent across decades and vast geographic distances. Something large and intelligent lived in those mountains, and it had been there long before European settlement. My first field assignment came in late May 1989 in the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee. A park ranger had reported finding a line of tracks near a remote campground. Tracks that measured 17 inches long and showed clear toe impressions and a stride length of nearly 6 feet. The ranger had photographed them before a storm washed them away, and the photographs had made their way through channels to our office. I drove down with a partner, an agent who had been with the task force for 8 years and knew the terrain. We met the ranger at the campground after hours when the area had been cleared of visitors. He was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder at the tree line, and spoke in a low voice, even though we were alone. He said he had worked in the park for 15 years and had heard stories from older rangers about things moving through the forest at night, but he had never believed them until he saw the tracks. We hiked 2 miles into the backcountry to where the ranger had seen the prints. The storm had done its work, but faint depressions remained in the clay soil near a creek bed. My partner took measurements and photographs while I examined the surrounding area. I found broken branches at heights that made no sense, clean snaps at 8 and 9 feet that would have required a ladder for a human to reach. I found a tree with bark stripped away in a vertical line, exposing fresh wood underneath, and when I looked closer, I saw what appeared to be claw marks gouged deep into the trunk. The ranger stood back and watched us work. Before we left, my partner took him aside and had a conversation I was not privy to. Later, driving back, my partner told me the ranger would be transferring to a different park within the month and that his photographs would disappear from Park Service records. Standard protocol. Over the next 3 years, I responded to dozens of incidents across Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. I learned to recognize the signs of genuine encounters versus misidentifications or hoaxes. I learned that the creature was most active during spring and fall, that it avoided areas with heavy human presence. It demonstrated intelligence in the way it moved through terrain and evaded detection. I collected hair samples that DNA analysis could not match to any known primate. I made casts of tracks that showed dermal ridges and anatomical features consistent across hundreds of samples taken over decades. I interviewed witnesses who described the same physical characteristics, the same behaviors, the same vocalizations. The evidence accumulated in classified files that grew thicker each year. The first time I saw the creature myself was in October 1992 in the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. I was investigating reports of something raiding a hunting camp, tearing through supplies and destroying equipment with what appeared to be calculated aggression. The hunters had fled and refused to return, and local law enforcement had found the camp in ruins with massive footprints in the mud around the perimeter. I arrived at dusk with another agent, and we set up observation in a blind we constructed from fallen branches and camouflage netting about 50 yards from the destroyed camp. We sat in silence as darkness fell, using night vision equipment to scan the tree line. The forest went quiet around midnight. That absolute silence that experienced outdoorsmen know means a large predator is near. Every bird stopped calling. Every small animal froze. It emerged from the trees at the far edge of the clearing, moving with a fluid gait that seemed wrong for something so massive. The night vision turned it into a green silhouette, but I could see the details clearly enough. It stood at least 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed too broad for any human proportion. The arms hung longer than they should, reaching past the knees, and the entire body was covered in dark hair that appeared shaggy and unkempt. The face was flat, more human than ape, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide jaw. It moved into the camp area and began methodically sorting through the debris, picking up items and examining them before tossing them aside. The movement showed intelligence and curiosity. This was not an animal foraging randomly. This was deliberate investigation. We watched for perhaps 10 minutes as it worked through the camp. At one point, it found a backpack that still had food inside and ripped it open with casual strength that sent supplies scattering. It ate some of the food, tossed the rest aside, and moved to a tent that had been partially collapsed. It grabbed the tent fabric and pulled, collapsing the entire structure with one motion, then stood over it as if considering whether to investigate further. Then it stopped. It went completely still in a way that made my stomach tighten. It turned slowly and looked directly at our blind. I do not know if it heard us or smelled us, or simply sensed our presence, but it knew we were there. The face turned toward us across 50 yards of darkness. Even through the night vision, I felt the weight of its attention. My partner grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. We did not move. We barely breathed. The creature stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably less than 30 seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, not hurrying, not showing any sign of fear or concern. It simply left, moving with the same fluid gait, and the forest swallowed it. The silence persisted for another 20 minutes before the normal night sounds gradually returned. We stayed in the blind until dawn, neither of us willing to move through the forest in darkness after what we had seen. When we finally packed up and examined the camp in daylight, we found fresh tracks that measured just over 18 inches and showed perfect anatomical detail in the soft ground. We photographed everything, collected samples, and filed a report that went into the classified database. The hunters who owned the camp were told that bears had destroyed their site and were offered compensation for their losses. They took the money and never came back. That sighting changed something in how I approached the work. Before, it had been an intellectual exercise, collecting evidence and managing information with the detached professionalism I had developed over decades of investigations. After seeing the creature myself, I understood viscerally why the Bureau had maintained the suppression protocol for so long. The public was not prepared for proof of something like this. The implications were too destabilizing if Bigfoot was real and this smart. If a 9-foot bipedal primate could exist undetected in one of the most populous regions of the country, what did that say about our understanding of the natural world? What did it say about our control over the environment? The questions multiplied, and each one led to conclusions that would undermine public confidence in institutions that claimed to have comprehensive knowledge of American wildlife. I began to understand the scope of the suppression effort. The task force had relationships with every major news organization, ready to provide alternative explanations for any reports that gained traction. We had protocols for handling physical evidence that appeared in civilian hands, usually involving confidential purchases or quiet confiscation, justified under various federal authorities. We monitored researchers and enthusiasts who got too close to genuine evidence, not to harm them, but to ensure their findings remained in the realm of speculation rather than proof. We maintained a network of contacts in universities who could be relied upon to debunk or discredit legitimate samples if they reached academic analysis. The system was comprehensive and had been refined over decades. Very little escaped it. In 1994, I was assigned to investigate an incident in the Great Smoky Mountains that would become the most significant encounter of my career. A family of hikers had been camping in a backcountry site when something entered their camp at night. They described a creature that matched all the established parameters. But what made this incident different was what happened next. The creature had not simply investigated and left. It had stayed near their camp for hours, circling the perimeter, making vocalizations that the family described as complex and varied, almost conversational. At one point, it had approached to within 20 feet of their tent, close enough that they could hear its breathing and smell the musky odor that many witnesses reported. The father had a video camera and managed to film several seconds of footage through the tent mesh before the batteries died. I reached the family within 18 hours of their report. They were staying at a ranger station, badly shaken, refusing to return to the backcountry. The father showed me the video camera. The footage was brief and shaky, but it showed a massive dark shape moving past the tent at close range. You could see the bulk of the shoulders, the arms swinging as it walked, and for just a moment, a partial profile of the face. It was the clearest footage I had seen in 5 years with the task force, the kind of footage that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. I told the family I needed to take the camera for analysis, that it was part of an ongoing investigation into wildlife behavior in the park. The father hesitated. He knew what he had filmed. He wanted the world to know. I could see it in his eyes. I explained that releasing the footage would cause problems for the Park Service, would bring hoaxers and thrill seekers into a fragile ecosystem, would create safety issues that could result in someone getting hurt. I appealed to his sense of responsibility as a parent and a citizen. I offered compensation for the camera and the disruption to their vacation. I implied that cooperation would be appreciated, while obstruction could lead to complications. It was not quite a threat, but it was close enough. He gave me the camera. 3 days later, I delivered it to the task force coordinator, who logged it into evidence and sent it to the vault. The family received a check and a letter thanking them for their cooperation with an ongoing federal investigation. The footage has never been seen outside the classified archive. I struggled with that incident for months afterward. I had joined federal law enforcement to protect people and uphold the truth. And here I was, suppressing evidence and manipulating civilians to maintain a lie. I understood the reasoning, understood the potential consequences of disclosure, but understanding did not make it sit any easier. I requested a meeting with the task force coordinator and asked directly why we continued the suppression when the evidence had become so overwhelming that disclosure seemed inevitable. He looked at me with the tired eyes of someone who had been having the same conversation for 20 years. He said the decision had been made at levels far above the Bureau, that multiple agencies were involved, and that the protocols would remain in place until someone with more authority than either of us decided otherwise. He said my job was to follow orders and maintain operational security, not to question policy. The encounters continued through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. The creature became more elusive as human activity expanded into remote areas, but it did not disappear. We documented encounters in places that seemed impossible, within miles of major highways, in state parks that saw thousands of visitors annually. The creature adapted, changing its patterns, becoming more nocturnal, avoiding areas where cameras had been deployed. The intelligence it demonstrated was remarkable. In several cases, we found evidence that it had systematically disabled trail cameras, not destroying them, but turning them to face different directions or covering the lenses with mud or leaves. It learned from exposure and modified its behavior accordingly. One of the most disturbing patterns we observed was what we called territory enforcement. In areas where the creature had established presence, it would react aggressively to humans who ventured too deep into its range, not attacking directly, but engaging in behavior clearly designed to frighten and drive people away. We documented cases of massive rocks being thrown at campsites from distances that suggested enormous strength. We investigated incidents where trees were pushed over near hiking trails while people were present. We interviewed witnesses who described being followed for miles by something that stayed just out of sight, but made its presence known through sound and movement. The message was always clear: leave. You're not welcome here. And most people did leave, fled in terror, and told stories that were dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. In 2003, I was part of a team that investigated what remains the most significant physical evidence case in task force history. A group of bow hunters in West Virginia found a site that appeared to be some kind of nesting area or long-term shelter. It was located in a cave system that required difficult climbing to access, far from any established trails. Inside the cave, they found bedding made from moss and leaves, remnants of food including deer bones that showed signs of being processed by something with human-like intelligence, and a collection of objects that suggested the creature was capable of complex behavior. There were smooth stones arranged in patterns, pieces of antler that had been modified into tools, and sections of rope and fabric that appeared to have been scavenged from human sources. The hunters photographed everything before one of them had the presence of mind to contact authorities rather than the media. We arrived within hours and secured the site. What we found went beyond anything in the existing evidence base. The cave showed signs of repeated occupation over what might have been years. We found multiple sleeping areas suggesting this was not a solitary creature, but possibly a family group. We collected hair samples, scat, and food remains that would provide the most complete biological profile we had ever obtained. But what struck me most was the evidence of intelligence. The modified antler pieces were clearly tools, shaped with intention for specific purposes. The stone arrangements appeared deliberate, possibly decorative or symbolic. This was not animal behavior, this was something approaching culture. We spent 3 days documenting the site before extracting everything of evidential value. We removed every trace that humans had been there, swept the cave floors, even used chemical agents to eliminate scent markers. We wanted the creatures to return, to continue using the site, so we could establish surveillance and potentially observe them in their own environment. 2 weeks later, we had cameras and audio equipment installed in concealed positions, covering all approaches to the cave. We maintained that surveillance for 6 months. The creatures never returned. Somehow they knew the site had been compromised. They abandoned it completely despite the significant effort they had invested in establishing it. The intelligence that required was staggering. They understood not just that humans had been present, but that the site was no longer safe, that we represented a persistent threat to be avoided at all costs. The evidence from the cave went to a specialized laboratory that contracted with the Bureau for analysis of unusual biological samples. The DNA results came back inconclusive in the most frustrating way possible. The samples showed primate characteristics but did not match any known species in the genetic databases. The closest matches were to Homo sapiens, but with significant divergence that suggested either a previously unknown great ape or something that split from the human lineage much earlier than any recognized hominin. The lab director told me privately that publishing these results would require explanations he could not provide, evidence chains he could not document. It would likely end his career in professional disgrace. The results were classified and filed. The hunters who found the cave received payment for their discretion and signed non-disclosure agreements backed by federal prosecution for violations. By 2005, I had been with the task force for 16 years. I had seen the creature multiple times, had collected evidence that would convince any objective scientist of its existence, and had participated in the systematic suppression of that evidence to maintain a fiction the public had been told for generations. I began to question whether the suppression was still justified, whether the potential consequences of disclosure were really worse than the continued deception. The internet had changed everything. People were sharing information faster than we could contain it. Videos appeared online that showed genuine footage mixed with hoaxes, and our ability to control the narrative was eroding. I raised these concerns in reports and meetings, suggesting that managed disclosure might be preferable to the chaos that would result when suppression inevitably failed. The response was predictable. I was reminded of my oath, reminded of the classification levels involved, reminded that policy decisions were made by people with access to information and perspectives I did not possess. I was told that my job was execution, not strategy. The message was clear. Stay in your lane or face consequences. I understood what that meant. Other agents who had pushed too hard on the disclosure question had found themselves transferred to career-ending assignments or pushed into early retirement with pension complications. The task force protected itself as vigorously as it protected the secret. I backed down and continued the work, but something had broken in my commitment to the mission. My last field operation came in 2007 in the mountains of North Carolina. A trail camera had captured footage of something extraordinary, a clear sequence of images showing a large bipedal figure walking past the camera at close range in broad daylight. The camera belonged to a wildlife researcher studying bear populations. He had already begun sharing the images with colleagues before we became aware of them. This was exactly the kind of situation the protocols were designed to prevent. Genuine evidence in the hands of someone with scientific credibility and the means to publish. I was sent to handle it personally because of my experience with researcher contacts and my success rate in evidence recovery. As I met the researcher at his office at a university, he was excited, convinced he had documented something significant, eager to discuss publication and further study. I let him talk while I examined the images. They were remarkable. Multiple frames showing the creature from different angles as it walked past the camera. You could see the muscle structure, the way the hair lay across the body, the proportions that were distinctly non-human. The face was partially visible in one frame, showing features that were simultaneously familiar and alien. This was publishable evidence. This would change everything. I told the researcher that the images showed exactly what he thought they showed, that they were potentially the most significant wildlife documentation in modern history, and that they needed to be handled with extreme care. I explained that premature release would bring scrutiny that could destroy his career, that images this significant needed to be authenticated through proper channels before publication, that I could facilitate that process through federal resources if he was willing to work with us. I appealed to his scientific training, his desire to be taken seriously, his fear of becoming another researcher dismissed as a crank or hoaxer. I spent 3 hours building trust and establishing the framework for cooperation. By the time I left, I had copies of all the images and his agreement to refrain from any publication or discussion until the authentication process was complete. I knew there would never be an authentication process. The images would disappear into classification. He would eventually be told that analysis had proven them to be misidentified bears or elaborate hoaxes. He would be angry, would probably suspect what had happened, but by then we would have had time to discredit him quietly if he tried to go public with claims he could no longer support with evidence. I submitted my retirement paperwork 2 weeks later. I could not continue the work knowing what I knew, having seen what I had seen, and participating in the suppression of truth that had consumed the last 18 years of my career. The Bureau processed my retirement efficiently, ensured my pension was in order, and had me sign additional non-disclosure agreements that extended beyond my employment. I was reminded that certain classified information remained protected regardless of my employment status, that violations would be prosecuted aggressively, and that they had ways of monitoring compliance. I signed everything they put in front of me and walked away from federal service in the summer of 2007. I spent the next several years trying to reconcile what I knew with what I was permitted to say. I watched researchers struggle for credibility while sitting on evidence that would validate their work completely. I watched television shows and documentaries that came tantalizingly close to the truth but could never quite reach it because the crucial evidence remained locked away. I watched the public dismiss and ridicule people who had seen exactly what I had seen, who were telling the truth but could never prove it. The injustice of it ate at me. These were honest people who had encountered something real and were being made to look foolish or mentally unstable because the evidence that would vindicate them was being systematically suppressed by the government they trusted. The creature is real. It exists in the Appalachian Mountains and has existed there for centuries at minimum, possibly far longer. It is a large bipedal primate of unknown classification that demonstrates intelligence comparable to or possibly exceeding that of great apes. It uses tools, modifies its environment, communicates with sophisticated vocalizations, and shows behavioral patterns that suggest cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. The population is small and declining, pressured by habitat loss and human encroachment, but it persists in the most remote sections of the mountain range. The federal government has known about it since at least the 1950s and has maintained active suppression of evidence since that time. Multiple agencies are involved, though the FBI has primary responsibility for evidence management and witness handling. The suppression protocols remain in effect and are enforced with the full weight of federal authority. The evidence exists in classified archives that span decades. Thousands of photographs, hundreds of hair and tissue samples, dental impressions, video footage, audio recordings, and detailed incident reports from trained observers. The evidence is overwhelming and consistent. It would convince any objective analyst of the creature's existence. But it remains classified under national security protocols that were established during the Cold War and have never been revisited. The justification has evolved over time. Initially, it was concern about Soviet exploitation of American uncertainty. Later, it became about maintaining public confidence in governmental competence. Now it is simply institutional inertia and the fear of consequences that would follow disclosure after so many decades of denial. I am coming forward now because I am old and angry and tired of carrying secrets that serve no legitimate purpose. I am violating multiple non-disclosure agreements and likely several federal statutes. I expect there will be consequences. They will deny everything I have said, will claim I am suffering from mental deterioration or seeking attention, will produce experts to discredit my account. They will never acknowledge the truth of what I am saying because doing so would require them to explain decades of suppression and deception. But I am beyond caring about their denials. I know what I saw. I know what exists in those mountains. And I know the public has a right to that information regardless of how uncomfortable it makes certain institutions. The creature deserves better than to be a secret hidden by frightened bureaucrats. It deserves recognition as a unique and valuable part of our natural heritage. The habitat it depends on deserves protection based on honest assessment of what lives there, rather than the fiction that has been maintained for public consumption. The witnesses who have seen it deserve validation rather than ridicule. The researchers who have dedicated their lives to proving its existence deserve access to the evidence that would vindicate their work. The American public deserves the truth about what inhabits the wilderness they believe they understand. All of this has been denied for reasons that made sense to someone decades ago, but have long since ceased to serve any legitimate purpose. I spent 18 years of my life maintaining a lie. I used my authority and training to intimidate witnesses, confiscate evidence, and ensure that truth remained hidden. I am not proud of that work. I justified it at the time as necessary service to larger purposes I did not fully understand. But looking back, I see it for what it was. It was a betrayal of the oath I took to serve the public interest. It was participation in a systematic program of deception that served institutional interests at the expense of scientific knowledge and public understanding. I cannot undo what I did, cannot return the evidence I confiscated or restore the credibility of the witnesses I discredited. But I can tell the truth now, consequences be damned, and hope that someone with more courage than I possessed will take that truth and do something meaningful with it. The Appalachian Mountains hold one of the most significant zoological discoveries of modern times, a large primate species that has managed to persist in an increasingly human-dominated landscape through intelligence, adaptability, and profound wariness of our kind. It exists. The government knows it exists. The evidence has been documented, catalogued, and hidden for more than 70 years. That suppression continues today under protocols that have been updated for the digital age, but remain fundamentally unchanged in purpose. The task force still operates, still responds to incidents, still ensures that proof never reaches the threshold of public acceptance. They are good at what they do. They have had decades to perfect the methods, but they cannot suppress the truth forever, and they cannot silence everyone who knows. I am one voice among many who could come forward if they found the courage or the motivation. Other agents who work the task force know what I know. Scientists who analyze samples know what they found. Park rangers and local law enforcement who provided the initial reports know what they saw. Witnesses across 6 states know their encounters were real regardless of how they have been dismissed. The truth is distributed among hundreds of people, and suppression only works as long as all of them remain silent. I am breaking that silence. I accept whatever consequences follow. I am beyond the reach of career retaliation and too old to care much about legal prosecution. Let them come. Let them deny. Let them explain why a retired federal agent with an exemplary service record would invent such an elaborate story and risk everything to tell it. The questions that follow might finally force the conversation that should have happened decades ago. To those who are reading this and dismissing it as fantasy or delusion, I understand your skepticism. I would have reacted the same way before I saw the evidence myself. But I am asking you to consider the possibility that your skepticism is exactly what has allowed the suppression to continue for so long. The assumption that such a thing cannot be hidden, cannot be real, cannot exist. In modern America is precisely what makes the hiding possible. Question the official denials as vigorously as you question my claims. Ask why a government that struggles to keep minor secrets would be so successful at keeping this one. Ask why there are gaps in wildlife databases, why certain research has been classified, why some evidence has disappeared from public collections. Ask uncomfortable questions and do not accept comfortable answers. The truth is out there in those mountains, and it has been waiting for recognition far too long. I will end with a final observation from my years in the field. The creature avoids us not from fear in the traditional sense, but from a kind of wise caution born of long experience with our species. It has learned that contact brings nothing but danger and disruption. It has adapted to our expansion by becoming more secretive, more careful, more deliberate in avoiding detection. In a way, it has become the perfect cryptid, real enough to leave traces but elusive enough to remain deniable. It survives in the margins we have left it, in the spaces we have not yet filled completely, and it watches us from those shadows with intelligence we barely acknowledge. I saw that intelligence in its eyes during those encounters in the field. I saw awareness and calculation and something that looked remarkably like understanding. It knows what we are. It knows what we represent. And it has chosen to remain hidden not because it lacks the capacity to reveal itself, but because it has assessed the cost of contact and found it too high. That assessment may be the saddest truth in this entire story. The creature that has been the subject of so much speculation and ridicule possesses the wisdom to avoid us, to recognize that nothing good comes from human knowledge of its existence. It has made itself a secret and maintained that secret with more success than our government has managed, despite all its resources and authority. Perhaps we should take that as a lesson about what it means to coexist with intelligence different from our own. Perhaps we should consider what it says about us, that the most successful strategy for an unknown primate in North America is to remain unknown. But those are philosophical questions beyond the scope of what I came here to say. I came to tell the truth as I know it, to put on record what I saw and what I did, and what the government has hidden. The rest is up to others to investigate, to confirm, to act upon as they see fit. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing. For more interesting stories, check this out.